So let's talk about Book One of Plato's Republic. As you'll see in other places in the introductory material for this course, these videos are not meant to be a substitute for doing the reading. I'd like you to watch the videos. I think that they'll help. But they're meant as a support for your reading. They're meant to help with the reading. I will not be going over it point by point. I'll be making general remarks about the reading. And I hope that they help you to read it with more profit. So, Book One of the Republic is a very extremely interesting document unto itself. My personal opinion is that Plato wrote Book One, and that's all he meant to write at first. It has a self contained structure, and in itself, Book One is, I think, quite similar to other shorter dialogues that Plato wrote at about the same time, but that he thought that there was unfinished business. Uh, he thought that the kind of response that he gives to the challenge that he tries to meet about justice and the just life in this Book One, that he had a better and necessarily longer response, and that's why we have the rest of the book. But Book One can be read by itself. I mean, Book One is an independent, unlike the other books of Plato's Republic, Book One is a self contained, independent thing. It has a certain structure, it does certain philosophical work, but again, Plato wanted to follow up on some issues that maybe he felt he hadn't addressed in a full enough way. I think as we go through the dialogue, and it is a dialogue, I mean, it's a dialogue between Socrates and his friends. And there's things that happen. Um, but of course, we are concentrating here, or perhaps should concentrate, on the theme of justice. There's a few key points that I think, a few key moments in the dialogue that you need to pay attention to, and then it all sort of comes together. And the first is Socrates' conversation with the older man Cephalus. They're at his house, and Socrates asks him how he's been doing, and Cephalus, who's gotten older, talks about old age. And what he says is really wonderful, I think, about what it's like to get old. But that conversation, really as a result of Socrates' interest, turns by the end of it into a question. And that question is about justice, um, and what it means to be just. And that really starts off the whole thing, the whole of the Republic. And it starts off with Socrates asking Cephalus whether he thinks that justice means telling the truth and paying your debts. And we see that there are certain problems with defining it that way. Of course, definition here, especially in Book One, is really what it's all about. It begins to be a discussion in which Socrates and various people try to define justice. Cephalus is really not interested in participating in a full, demanding philosophical inquiry into the nature of justice. So the second person that Socrates talks to, Polemarchus, who is Cephalus' son, begins that with Socrates. And various definitions of what justice is are considered and rejected because they have problems. And really, the one that I would pay attention to most closely is what is offered here at the top of page. Geez, what page are we on? Do we not have page numbers? I thought we had page numbers. I'm sorry. In this, at the top of page here, where Polemarchus has quoted the poet Simonides, and Simonides says it is just to give to each what is owed to him. And that's not bad, I think, as a definition of justice. That it's just to, if everybody gets what they deserve, if everybody gets what is owed to them, then we have justice. And but Socrates pushes a little bit there. What does it mean to what are people owed? And Polemachus says, uh, friends owe something good to their friends, never something bad. And then Socrates says, well, okay, but what do you owe to your enemies? And Polemachus says, well, you owe your enemies harm. That's what's appropriate for your enemies. So to be just is to do good things to your friends and to harm your enemies. And this is actually incredibly important because this gives us a sense of what ancient Greek culture really, what the dominant beliefs were at the time, what it meant to be a real man or be a proper man. And it meant to be able to help your friends and harm your enemies. And that's the position that Socrates really, really dislikes. And what he tries to get Polemachus to admit is that if you're really just, you do good to everybody, not just your friends, but everybody. And that a just man or a just person harms no one, which is something that Polemachus accepts reluctantly. Um, he says here, I'm sorry, page numbers, but he says eventually, no, by Zeus, it isn't, but I do not know anymore what I meant. I still believe this, however, that benefiting one's friends and harming one's enemies is justice. And that's a very, very stubborn belief, I think. And Polemachus is simply being candid that, well, you've shown me that there's a weakness in my position, but I still believe this. And again, Socrates seems very intent to refute this idea that we should ever harm anybody, even our enemies. And eventually he gets Polemachus to admit to this, that the justice is good. And if you're doing a good thing, it won't harm anybody, which is a very, I think, rational position. And after this discussion with Polemachus, in which he eventually gets Polemachus to admit this, that the just man harms no one, that's when Thrasymachus, his character, who's so important here, jumps in. And Thrasymachus says a lot of things, a lot of very provocative things about justice. But he also changes the conversation uh, with his definition of justice so that they're really focusing on something else. What does he say justice is? Justice is the advantage of the stronger, which is a very, very famous and very paradoxical thing to say. Justice is simply the advantage of the stronger. And he explains what that means. I mean, that justice is whatever the strong say is justice, that's what's justice. And whoever has the power to define it, that's what justice is. And they define it, the powerful, to their own advantage. So if the rich rule a city, it's the rich. Justice is what's good for the rich. And if the tyrant rules the city, justice is what's good for the individual tyrant, etc. It's a very powerful position. And immediately, what follows for Thrasymachus from this definition of justice is that you'd be a fool to be just, because if you're just doing what's to somebody else's advantage rather than your own. So the definition of justice, very provocative definition of justice, that it's simply the advantage of the stronger, leads immediately to a more practical proposition about how you should live your life. You should avoid justice. You should avoid being just. You should be unjust. Justice is what helps somebody else. Injustice is what helps yourself. So this leads to this incredible thesis, which is so important for understanding the Republic, that we have a question here about how we should live. Thrasymachus has laid out a position that says how you should live your life is you shouldn't worry about justice. You should feel free to be unjust, because being unjust is doing what makes you happy and what's good for you. Being just is just doing what's good for the powerful. Socrates hates this thesis, and he and Thrasymachus really get into it. And Thrasymachus is really a very unpleasant person, says shockingly uh, rude things to Socrates. But Socrates, being Socrates, doesn't take the bait and really is only interested in the philosophy. Well, is it really true, though? Justice is simply the advantage of the stronger. Is it really true that you should be unjust rather than just if you want to be happy? And he gives his arguments. That justice must be a form of knowledge, and it's a kind of craft or knowledge. And if you're being just, you're like a doctor or a shoemaker. You're doing something that is essentially for someone else. You're healing someone else. You're providing someone else with shoes. And although you do it for money, when you're doing it for somebody else. So in being just, it's really the advantage of somebody else, and not the advantage of the stronger. It's doing something. So being just is not simply the advantage of the stronger. And moreover, that you'll be happier if you're just than if you're unjust. And that's where we end that's where we end book one, with Socrates getting Thrasymachus to admit that he was wrong. That is, that justice is not simply the advantage of the stronger, and also that it is better to be just than to be unjust. But this leaves us at the end of the dialogue. You get the feeling that Thrasymachus hasn't really accepted what Socrates has to say, but it's clear what Socrates wants to prove by this point. And perhaps he wants to prove that all the definitions of justice that have been offered in book one are incorrect in some way or another. But he definitely wants to prove that you will be better off being just. You will be happier, you will be more fulfilled being just than you will being unjust. And again, we have the rest of the book as evidence that Plato felt in writing this, that he was not satisfied with his proof that he has Socrates make for this proposition. That is, that justice is better than injustice, that a just life is happier and better than an unjust one. He must have felt that he had more, that the question was so important that he had more to give in support of his belief. And that's why, really, we have the rest of the book.